While I was watching TV, my husband stormed in, and after my mother-in-law whispered something, his face turned dark with rage. He shouted, "Why are you wasting time?" and smashed the TV on my head. Bleeding and begging for help, I was dragged by my hair and thrown out. Shaking, I called my brother, but when he arrived, what followed was more terrifying than I could have imagined. My name is Harper Collins, and what I'm about to share is a story I never thought I'd live to tell. It's a story of love, betrayal, and ultimately, finding my strength in the midst of unimaginable pain. If someone had told me 3 years ago that I'd be sitting here recounting this, I wouldn't have believed them. But life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? It all started when I met Jonathan Carter. I was 26, living in Seattle and working as a graphic designer for a small firm. My life was simple and steady. Then Jonathan came into my world, a 30-year-old banker with the kind of charm that could light up a room. He was polite, well-spoken, and made me feel like the most important person in his life. Our romance was a whirlwind. Dinners at fancy restaurants, walks along the waterfront, and hours spent talking about our dreams. He seemed perfect, and when he proposed 6 months later, I said yes without hesitation. My friends called us the perfect couple, and I believed it. But as I've learned, perfection is often an illusion. After our wedding, we moved into a beautiful house in one of Seattle's quieter neighborhoods. At first, it felt like a dream come true. I threw myself into making our house a home, cooking Jonathan's favorite meals and making sure everything was just right. He worked long hours at the bank, and though I missed him during the day, I convinced myself it was all part of building our future together. It wasn't long before cracks began to show. Jonathan's mother, Patricia, moved in with us a few months after the wedding. She claimed she needed to help out, but it quickly became clear she was there to control. Patricia was in her late 50s, a retired schoolteacher who carried herself with an air of authority. She had strong opinions about everything: how the house should be run, how I should dress, even what I should cook for Jonathan. At first, I tried to get along with her. After all, she was my husband's mother. I listened politely when she criticized me for being too modern or when she insisted I wasn't managing the household properly. But no matter how hard I tried, it was never enough for her. And worse, Jonathan started siding with her. "Harper, Mom's just trying to help," he'd say whenever I tried to voice my concerns. "You should listen to her. She knows what she's talking about." It hurt, but I told myself it was just a phase. Things would get better, right? But they didn't. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, I finished all the housework and sat down on the sofa to watch TV. It was a small comfort, one of the few things that helped me unwind. I remember thinking how much I missed my father, who had passed away a year before the wedding. The TV was his gift to me, and watching it always brought back warm memories. Jonathan came home late that night. He looked tired but still greeted me with a smile. For a moment, I felt relief. Maybe tonight would be peaceful. But then Patricia appeared, whispering something into his ear. Whatever she said, it changed his expression instantly. He glared at me, his eyes cold. "Get up," he said, his tone sharp. "Go to the kitchen and make me a fresh meal." I blinked in surprise. "The dinner's already ready, Jonathan. I kept it warm for you." "I don't want that," he snapped. "I want something fresh. Now." I hesitated. I was tired, and I couldn't understand why he was being so unreasonable. "Jonathan, I've been on my feet all day. Can't you just—" Before I could finish, he exploded. "How dare you talk back to me?" He strode across the room, and before I could move, he grabbed the TV, my father's TV, and lifted it above his head. I didn't have time to react. He hurled it down, and the corner of it smashed into the side of my head. Pain erupted, and I crumpled to the floor, blood trickling down my face. I was too shocked to cry. I just stared at him, my vision blurred, my heart pounding. "Maybe this will teach you to obey me," he growled. Patricia stood nearby, arms crossed, a smug expression on her face. "You don't deserve to live here if you can't respect us," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. I begged for help, my voice trembling. "Jonathan, please. I'm hurt." But neither of them cared. Patricia continued shouting at me, and Jonathan dragged me to the door. "Get out," he spat, shoving me into the cold night. I stood there, bleeding and shaking, unable to process what had just happened. With nowhere else to go, I called my brother, Daniel. As soon as he answered, I broke down. "Harper," he said, his voice sharp with concern. "What's wrong?" "Jonathan, I need help, Daniel. Please." "Where are you?" he asked, his voice firm. "I'm coming to get you right now." I gave him my location and waited in the darkness, my mind a swirl of fear and disbelief. What had my life become? How had I ended up here? When Daniel arrived, his face was a mix of anger and worry. He helped me into his car and drove straight to the hospital. "We're going to fix this," he said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I promise you, Harper. He's not going to get away with this." As the doctor tended to my wound, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. For the first time, I realized I didn't have to endure this anymore. But I also knew that this was just the beginning. Jonathan and Patricia had betrayed me in ways I couldn't ignore, and I was going to make sure they paid for it. Sitting in the hospital that night, I couldn't stop trembling. The pain in my head was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the ache in my chest. As the nurse cleaned my wound and applied stitches, Daniel sat by my side, fuming silently. I could see the anger radiating off him, but he held back his words, waiting until I was ready to talk. Once we got back to his apartment, he sat me down with a glass of water and said, "Harper, tell me everything. I need to know exactly what's been happening." I hesitated. Where could I even begin? But I knew I had to tell him. So, I started from the beginning, recounting every instance of Patricia's interference and Jonathan's growing coldness. I told him about how I tried to please them, how I hoped things would get better, and how it all escalated to that horrifying moment when Jonathan smashed the TV on my head. Daniel listened intently, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. By the time I finished, he was seething. "He's a monster," Daniel said, his voice low but full of rage. "And his mother is no better. Harper, you can't go back there. Ever." "I know," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "But what can I do? They've made it clear I don't belong there. I don't even have my belongings." "Forget your things," Daniel said firmly. "What matters is your safety. We'll figure the rest out. But first, we're going to make sure they pay for what they've done to you." I nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and relief. For the first time in months, I felt like I wasn't alone. Daniel was my rock, and I knew he wouldn't let me face this on my own. Over the next few days, I stayed with Daniel, trying to recover both physically and emotionally. He helped me file for divorce, and while the process was daunting, it was also liberating. Cutting ties with Jonathan felt like regaining a part of myself that I'd lost. But I knew divorce wasn't enough. The anger and humiliation burned inside me, and I wanted justice. Jonathan and Patricia had destroyed my trust, my confidence, and my sense of safety. I couldn't let them get away with it. One evening, as I sat in Daniel's living room, I said, "I want to do more than just leave him. I want to expose him for what he really is." Daniel looked at me, his eyes narrowing in thought. "What do you mean?" "I mean, he's not the man he pretends to be," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "I've always had this feeling that he's hiding something. The way he's so secretive about his work, the late hours, the unexplained phone calls. It doesn't add up." Daniel nodded slowly. "You might be onto something. If he's hiding something, we'll find it. Let's dig deeper." That's when we decided to hire a private investigator. Daniel found a man named Jack Lewis, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for getting results. When we met with Jack, I explained my suspicions about Jonathan's activities at the bank. Jack listened carefully, took detailed notes, and promised to start investigating immediately. The waiting was agonizing. Every day, I wondered what Jack would uncover. Part of me worried I was overreacting, that I was chasing ghosts. But another part of me, the part that had lived with Jonathan's lies and manipulation, knew there was something dark beneath the surface. Then, about 2 weeks later, Jack called. "I've found something," he said. "Can we meet in person?" My heart pounded as Daniel and I drove to Jack's office. When we sat down, Jack laid out the evidence he'd gathered. The truth was worse than I could have imagined. Jonathan wasn't just a controlling husband. He was a criminal. He had been embezzling money from the bank, laundering it through fake accounts, and funneling it into offshore holdings. Jack showed us documents, account statements, and even surveillance photos. It was undeniable. I stared at the evidence, my mind reeling. I knew he was hiding something, I said softly. But this is huge, Daniel said, his voice filled with determination. We're taking this to the authorities. Jack nodded. You should. But be careful. People like Jonathan don't react well when they're cornered. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I knew Jack was right. Jonathan was dangerous, and this was no longer just about me. His actions had harmed others, and I couldn't let him continue. The next day, Daniel and I went to the police with Jack's evidence. Detective Rebecca Hayes, the officer assigned to the case, listened carefully as we laid everything out. This is solid, she said, flipping through the files. We'll start an investigation immediately. Leaving the station, I felt a mix of emotions, fear, relief, and a strange sense of power. For so long, I had felt helpless, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. But now, I was fighting back. And for the first time in a long time, I believed I might actually win. Little did I know the battle was only just beginning. The days after meeting Detective Hayes were a blur of nervous energy. The police had taken over the investigation, and I found myself anxiously waiting for updates. I kept replaying Jack's words in my head. Jonathan was dangerous. I had always known he had a temper, but now I was seeing him in a completely different light. This wasn't just about his cruelty toward me. This was about him being a man who broke laws, betrayed trust, and lived a double life. I tried to stay busy, throwing myself into anything that could distract me. Daniel was my constant source of strength, always checking in and reminding me that I wasn't alone in this. But even his reassurances couldn't fully ease my fears. I knew that once Jonathan found out what was happening, there would be no turning back. About a week later, Detective Hayes called me in for a meeting. When Daniel and I arrived at the station, she had a folder on her desk, her expression serious but determined. We've made significant progress, she began, gesturing for us to sit. Thanks to the evidence your investigator provided, we were able to confirm that Jonathan is involved in a large-scale money laundering operation. He's been embezzling funds from the bank for over 2 years and using shell companies to cover his tracks. The scope of his crimes is massive. Hearing it spelled out like that left me breathless. I had suspected he was hiding something, but the extent of his betrayal was staggering. What happens now? I asked, my voice shaky. We've built a strong case against him, Detective Hayes said. We've already started monitoring his movements, and we're preparing to make an arrest. But I need you to be careful. Once he realizes the net is closing in, he might try to contact you, or worse. I nodded, gripping the edge of my chair. I won't let him get to me, I said, though deep down, I was terrified. As we left the station, Daniel turned to me. You're handling this incredibly well, Harper. I know it's not easy. It's not, I admitted, but I need to see this through. After everything he's done, I can't let him walk away. That evening, I sat alone in Daniel's living room, staring out the window. My mind wandered back to the beginning of my relationship with Jonathan. How could the man who once held my hand and promised me a lifetime of happiness be the same man who smashed a TV over my head and embezzled millions? The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined, but it also fueled my resolve. He had taken enough from me. It was time for him to face the consequences. The next few days were tense. I couldn't stop imagining what would happen when Jonathan was arrested. Would he lash out? Would he deny everything? Part of me dreaded the confrontation, but another part, one I barely recognized, wanted to see him brought down. Finally, the call came. Detective Hayes informed us that Jonathan had been taken into custody earlier that morning. He didn't resist, she said, her tone calm but firm. But he's claiming innocence. He's saying it's all a misunderstanding. Of course he is, I said bitterly. That's what he's always done. Pretend to be the victim. Despite his denial, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Knowing he was behind bars, even temporarily, gave me a sense of safety I hadn't felt in months. But I knew this was far from over. The next step was the court case, and I would have to relive everything to ensure he faced justice. As I prepared for the trial, memories of Jonathan haunted me. I remembered the way he'd look at me with disdain when I didn't meet his impossible expectations. I remembered the nights I cried myself to sleep, wondering why I wasn't enough for him. And I remembered the moment he threw me out, bleeding and broken, as if I were nothing. But those memories didn't break me. If anything, they made me stronger. I channeled my pain into determination, knowing I had to stand up not just for myself, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel powerless. The day of the trial arrived quickly. The courtroom was intimidating, with its high ceilings and rows of wooden benches. I sat with Daniel, clutching his hand for support as Jonathan was brought in. He looked calm, almost smug, as if he believed he could talk his way out of this. But as the prosecution presented the evidence, the documents, the surveillance photos, the testimony from the investigator, I saw his confidence falter. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand with shaky legs but a steady heart. I recounted everything, the abuse, the lies, the night he hit me with the TV. My voice wavered at times, but I didn't stop. I refused to let him silence me again. Jonathan's defense tried to paint me as a bitter ex-wife seeking revenge, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. By the time the trial concluded, it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that he was guilty. The judge's verdict came swiftly. Jonathan was convicted on multiple counts of embezzlement, money laundering, and fraud. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. As the gavel struck, I felt an immense sense of relief. He couldn't hurt me anymore. When the judge announced Jonathan's sentence, 12 years in federal prison, a wave of emotions washed over me. Relief, disbelief, and even sadness mingled together. But one feeling stood out above the rest: freedom. For the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe. He couldn't hurt me anymore. He couldn't manipulate me, control me, or break me. Justice had been served. After the trial, Daniel and I stepped outside the courthouse. The sun was shining, but I still felt heavy. It was as if the weight of everything I'd been through was just now sinking in. Daniel placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did it, Harper," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You stood up to him." I nodded, my throat tight. "I couldn't have done it without you," I said. "You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." The next few weeks were a blur as I tried to pick up the pieces of my life. Moving forward wasn't as easy as I had hoped. I still carried the scars, both physical and emotional, from everything Jonathan had done. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night, reliving the moments of his anger, his violence. But each day, I reminded myself that I was stronger than those memories. I had survived, and I wasn't going to let him define me. One of the first steps I took toward healing was reclaiming my independence. I moved into a small apartment in downtown Seattle, not far from my office. It wasn't much, a one-bedroom with a tiny kitchen and creaky floors, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture I picked out, every picture I hung on the walls, felt like a declaration of my new life. For the first time, I had a space that was truly mine, free from Jonathan's shadow. Work became another refuge. I poured myself into my designs, finding solace in the creative process. My boss, who had always been supportive, gave me opportunities to take on bigger projects, and I slowly began to rebuild my confidence. It wasn't easy. I still had moments of doubt, wondering if I was truly capable, but with each success, I proved to myself that I was. Daniel remained my rock through it all. He checked in on me constantly, whether it was bringing over groceries or just sitting with me on the couch, watching movies and talking about anything but the past. He reminded me that I wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. One day, as I was organizing some old papers, I came across a photograph from my wedding. In the picture, Jonathan was smiling at me, his arm wrapped around my waist. I stared at it for a long time, trying to reconcile the man in the photo with the man who had hurt me so deeply. Eventually, I tore the picture in half and threw it away. It felt symbolic, like I was finally letting go of the version of him I had once loved. But my healing wasn't just about forgetting, it was about learning. I took time to reflect on everything I had endured, and I realized how much stronger it had made me. I had found a resilience within myself that I didn't know existed. I had faced betrayal, humiliation, and pain, and I had come out the other side. I wasn't the same person I had been when I married Jonathan, but I was okay with that. The new version of me was braver, wiser, and determined to never let anyone take away my power again. As for Jonathan, his sentencing sent shockwaves through the community. His crimes made headlines, and the bank he worked for issued a public apology for failing to catch his fraudulent activities sooner. I heard through the grapevine that Patricia, his mother, had moved away, likely out of embarrassment. Part of me wanted to confront her, to demand an apology for the way she had treated me, but I realized it wasn't worth it. She wasn't worth it. My energy was better spent on myself and my future. One evening, Daniel and I went out for dinner to celebrate. It wasn't a big occasion, just the two of us at a small Italian restaurant, but it felt significant. As we clinked our glasses together, he said, "To your freedom." "To my freedom," I echoed, smiling for what felt like the first time in ages. It was a genuine smile, one that came from a place of peace. Now, as I sit here telling the story, I realize how far I've come. What happened to me was horrific, but it didn't break me. It taught me that I deserve better, that I have a voice and a right to stand up for myself. And most importantly, it taught me that no matter how dark things seem, there's always a way out. Jonathan may have thought he could control me forever, but he underestimated me. He underestimated the strength I had buried deep inside. And now, as I look ahead to the future, I know one thing for sure. I'm free. Free to live, to dream, and to build a life on my own terms. And that, to me, is the greatest revenge of all.